On a November night in 1943, the people of a small English village called Imber were gathered into their school hall by representatives of the British War Office and told they had 47 days to leave. Not to evacuate temporarily, not to seek shelter until a threat passed, to pack what they could carry, vacate the homes some of their families had occupied for generations, and hand the entire village over to the military for use as an American training ground in preparation for the Allied invasion of Europe. They were promised, in what would prove to be one of the most quietly broken guarantees in modern British history, that they would be allowed to return within 6 months of the war's end. The war ended. They were never allowed back. The 152 residents of Imber had been living as tenants on land the War Office had been steadily purchasing since the 1890s, which meant they had no legal right to refuse the eviction, no right of return, and no compensation beyond a small sum for moving costs. Albert Nash, the village blacksmith who had worked his forge in Imber for 4 decades, was reported by a local doctor to have wept for days after receiving the eviction notice. He died, not long afterward, the doctor recorded, of a broken heart. In 1961, roughly 2,000 people gathered in Imber for a demonstration demanding the village's return. The Ministry of Defense declined. The village remains in military hands today, used for urban warfare training, accessible to the public only on a small number of designated open days each year. When visitors are allowed in, what they find is a place that stopped being a village 8 decades ago and never quite managed to become anything else. The buildings that the Army didn't demolish stand in various states of decay, stripped of their interiors, their windows long since broken, their walls returning slowly to the chalk and flint of the Salisbury Plain beneath them. The Bell Inn, once the village pub, still stands. Imber Court, the manor house, still stands. The school where the residents gathered on that November night to be told their lives were about to change still stands. The only building maintained in reasonable condition is the Church of St. Giles, where a single service is held each year on the Saturday nearest to the 1st of September. Attended by descendants of the original villagers, by soldiers who have trained in the village, and by members of the public who have made the journey across a military training area to sit in a church in a village that officially no longer exists. The precise detail that makes Imber distinct from countless other places that were appropriated by governments and never returned is the specific language of the original eviction notice. When researchers eventually located the original letter sent to tenants, it contained wording that indicated return was expected after the wartime use concluded. This document, unearthed decades after the evacuation, became the foundation of subsequent campaigns arguing that the promise of return had been explicit and had been deliberately broken. The campaigns changed nothing. Imber remains inside the Salisbury Plain training area, surrounded by live firing ranges, its residents' descendants allowed to visit only on terms set by the institution that took the village from their families in 1943 and has never seen fit to give it back. 6,000 miles away, in the middle of the Namib Desert in what is now Namibia, there's a different kind of ghost town, one whose abandonment was driven not by military decree, but by the most straightforward possible economic logic. The resource that built it ran out. On an evening in 1908, a Namibian railway worker named Zacharias Lawala was clearing sand from railroad tracks in what was then German Southwest Africa, when he noticed stones in the sediment that caught the light differently from ordinary rock. He brought them to his supervisor, a German railway inspector named August Stauch, who immediately recognized what he had found: diamonds. The site they were standing on, 10 kilometers inland from the coastal port town of Luderitz in the southern Namib, turned out to be one of the richest alluvial diamond fields in the history of the world. The stones so densely concentrated in the surface sediment that for a brief, extraordinary period, they could be collected from the desert floor by hand, on hands and knees, without any heavy machinery at all. Within 2 years, a town had been constructed in the middle of one of the world's most forbidding environments. The German colonial administration declared the surrounding area a Sperrgebiet, a restricted zone, reserving diamond prospecting rights for a single Berlin-based company. Tribespeople displaced from their land by the zone's creation were employed as forced laborers in the mines, required to live in barracks compounds for months at a time. The town that rose above this exploitation was built in the style of a German village, incongruously lush in its appointments given the surrounding desert. At its peak, Kolmanskap produced over 2 million pounds worth of diamonds and featured a casino, school, hospital, and the first X-ray station in the southern hemisphere. The hospital's X-ray machine was reportedly installed not primarily for medical treatment, but to scan workers' bodies, checking whether any had swallowed diamonds to smuggle them out of the restricted zone. By the 1930s, intensive mining had depleted the area, and in 1928, the town's fate was sealed when the richest diamond fields ever known were found on beach terraces to the south. The population drained away. By 1956, Kolmanskap was completely abandoned, and the dunes that once rolled over the railway tracks began bursting through the ghost town's doors and porches, filling its rooms with smooth banks of sand. What the Namib Desert has done to Kolmanskap in the 7 decades since the last resident left is something that defies easy description. The arid conditions have preserved the architecture with an eerie completeness. The paint on the walls still visible in faded greens and blues, the wallpaper still partially adhering in some rooms, the bathtubs still sitting in their original positions. But the sand has entered through every opening and settled with the patient thoroughness of an occupying force, piling itself into drifts that reach halfway up walls, filling rooms to window level, covering floors and smooth, undulating surfaces that look less like sand and more like the desert practicing at being furniture. Walking through Kolmanskop today means wading through knee-deep sand in what were once the kitchens and sitting rooms of people who expected to grow rich here, ducking under door frames whose threshold had been raised by meters of accumulated desert. The town that was built to extract value from the desert has been very slowly returned to it, moving from the desert to the edge of the East China Sea, from a place abandoned because wealth was found elsewhere to a place abandoned because the sea itself made wealth impossible. Shengshan Island sits at the eastern edge of the Shengzi archipelago, a chain of roughly 400 islands scattered across the mouth of the Yangtze River, where it empties into the East China Sea, approximately 64 kilometers from Shanghai. The island is the easternmost inhabited island in the chain. Beyond it, nothing but open ocean stretching toward Japan. The fishing village of Haotuan was established in the 1950s, and at its peak in the 1980s, held over 2,000 residents, earning the local nickname Little Taiwan for its relative prosperity. The harbor that had made the village possible was a shallow, crescent-shaped bay adequate for the wooden fishing boats of the mid-20th century. When steel-hulled trawlers replaced those wooden boats as the technology of the fishing industry advanced, the harbor that had fed Haotuan for 30 years became an obstacle. The modern vessels that could compete in the growing industrial fishing economy based in Shanghai and other mainland ports could not use a harbor too shallow for their drafts. By the 1990s, the population began rapidly declining due to lack of adequate connection to the mainland, education, and job opportunities. And by 2002, the village had been entirely depopulated. What happened to Haotuan after the last resident left is what has made it, in the decades since photographs of it went viral in 2015, one of the most visually striking abandoned places on Earth. The subtropical humidity of the East China Sea and the particular character of the local vegetation conspired to cover every surface of the village in a single dense climbing vine known scientifically as Parthenoxyssus tricuspidata, the same plant that covers the walls of certain old universities in the English-speaking world. 2 decades of subtropical humidity sealed every window, carpeted every roof, and turned a working-class fishing town into the most photographed ruin in China. The result is a village that appears, from a distance, to be simply a hillside, the green so complete and so uniform that the underlying architecture is only visible on close inspection, when the outlines of windows and doorways begin to resolve through the foliage. The village's transformation from abandoned settlement to tourist attraction has been managed with some ambivalence. When interest in Haotuan first grew around 2015, a local official said the village hadn't been equipped with the conditions to open to tourists and urged visitors to preserve its tranquility. A viewing platform was eventually installed. A modest entrance fee was established. In 2021, the village welcomed 90,000 visitors, generating over 3 million yuan for the island economy. A handful of elderly residents who never left sell bottled water from the entrance, the only commerce in a settlement that once housed 2,000 fishermen and their families. The vines keep growing. The buildings they cover keep deteriorating beneath them. In another decade or two, the architecture may be gone entirely, and what was Haotuan will simply be a hillside above a shallow bay, with no indication remaining that a prosperous fishing community once watched its future disappear when the boats became too large for the harbor. In southern Italy, in the region of Basilicata, there is a town that didn't empty gradually, but was evacuated by formal government order, because the ground it was built on had decided it was done supporting the weight above it. Krakow sits on a 400-meter cliff overlooking the valleys of the Agri and Cavone rivers, a position chosen in antiquity for the same reason most medieval Italian hilltop settlements chose their locations. Height was security. Bandits and armies had to climb to reach you. A university was established in Krakow in 1276, and the population grew from 450 in 1277 to nearly 2,600 by 1561. The town had churches, noble palaces, a Norman bell tower that still stands, and the elongated, densely packed architecture of a community that had spent centuries making itself as defensible as possible by building upward rather than outward. The problem with building upward on a clay hillside in a seismically active region over the course of 7 centuries is that clay is not a stable foundation. In 1963, Krakow began to be evacuated due to a series of landslides, and the inhabitants moved to the valley of Krakow-Peshera, with the landslides appearing to have been provoked by works of infrastructure, sewer and water systems. The new pipes and drainage systems that the town had installed to improve its quality of life had altered the water flow through the clay subsoil in ways that destabilized what had already been a marginal geological situation. A flood in 1972 prevented any serious consideration of repopulation. After the 1980 Irpinia earthquake, the ancient site of Cracow was completely abandoned. What you walk through now is not ruin in the conventional sense. It is interruption, a town mid-sentence. The streets are still streets. The buildings that have not yet collapsed retain their facades, their doorways, their window openings. The sense of inhabitation interrupted rather than concluded. Inside the buildings that can still be safely entered, objects from the final years of occupation remain. Furniture, household implements, the residue of daily life, discontinued abruptly enough that there was no time or reason to clear everything out. Cracow has since been used as a filming location for several major productions, including Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ and the James Bond film Quantum of Solace. Its crumbling facades providing the visual language of ancient, specific devastation that no purpose-built set could convincingly replicate. The guided tours that are the only permitted way to visit Cracow today take visitors along a route designed to avoid the most structurally unstable sections. Your guide will point out where the landslide was, where the last family lived before the final evacuation, where the earthquake of 1980 did the damage that closed the question of whether anyone would ever return. The town on the cliff had survived plague, famine, bandit raids, the Napoleonic occupation, the upheaval of Italian unification, and 2 world wars. What finished it was the clay it had been built on for 700 years, and the water that began moving through that clay differently once the pipes arrived. In a meadow in central France, there is a village where the clocks stopped on June 10, 1944, and where Charles de Gaulle decreed they should never be allowed to start again. Well, Ordre-sur-Glane was, on the morning of that June day, a quiet farming community of roughly 650 people, its population swollen slightly above its pre-war number by the presence of refugees from other parts of France. 4 days after D-Day, a company of troops from the 2nd SS Panzerdivision Das Reich surrounded the village, rounded up its entire population, and separated them by gender. The men were taken to barns and agricultural outbuildings, while the women and children, including 207 children among them, were locked inside the village church. The barns were set on fire. Machine guns were used to finish those who attempted to flee the flames. The church was set on fire. Of the 642 inhabitants killed that day, there were only 10 survivors, who escaped by pretending to be dead. The reason a specific quiet French village was chosen for this specific act of annihilation on this specific afternoon has never been definitively established. Adolf Diekmann, the SS commander who ordered the massacre, had apparently intended to destroy Oradour-sur-Ver, a different village whose people were said to be providing food to the resistance, but had taken a wrong turn on the road. The village that was destroyed had no significant involvement with the resistance. The people who died in the barns and the church had done nothing to make themselves targets. They simply lived in the village that the SS happened to reach after making a wrong turn on an afternoon in June. After the war, Charles de Gaulle declared that the village should not be rebuilt, but preserved in its destroyed state as a memorial. A new oradour was constructed nearby for the survivors and their descendants. The old village was classified as a historic monument in 1946. The sign above its entrance reads, in French, Souviens-toi. Remember, walking through it today means walking through streets where the cars that were parked there on June 10, 1944, are still in their positions, their metal bodies rusted to the consistency of lace, their shapes still recognizable as automobiles from 8 decades ago. The sewing machines are still in the houses, the bicycles are still in the sheds. The church, where the women and children were locked, is still standing, its interior open to the sky, its walls bearing the marks of the fire that killed them. There is no reconstruction, no interpretation, no attempt to soften what the place is. It is simply the village as it was left on the evening of June 10, 1944, when the SS withdrew from the smoking ruins, preserved exactly as they left it. On the other side of the planet, in the most hostile environment on Earth, the ruins of Soviet ambition are being slowly consumed by something more patient than any army or any landslide. Molodioznaya Station in Antarctica was established in 1962 as a Soviet research hub and rocket test base. Beyond studying weather and cosmic radiation, it also served as a secretive rocket launch site during the Cold War, with over 1,000 test flights conducted. At its operational peak, the station housed more than 1,000 personnel across its various facilities, making it one of the largest Antarctic installations the Soviet Union maintained. Its location on the coast of Antarctica gave it strategic value in the context of Cold War scientific competition, and its research output covered everything from meteorology and glaciology to the kind of upper atmosphere studies that had obvious military applications. With the logistical challenges of Antarctica's brutal environment and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, the facility was abandoned in the early 1990s. What the Antarctic environment does to an abandoned human structure is different from what sand does to Kolmonskop or vines do to Hotuan. The cold preserves while simultaneously destroying. Metal rusts and brittles. Snow accumulates and compresses. Structures that were designed to shed Antarctic snowfall continue to shed it for a while, then begin to fail in ways that accelerate as each winter makes the damage slightly worse than the one before. Today, rusted metal frames and broken labs lie entombed in snow and ice, a frozen relic of Soviet ambition and forgotten space-age dreams. A few researchers from other Antarctic programs occasionally visit Molodezhnaya, as much out of historical interest as scientific purpose, to document what remains of a facility that once represented one of the most remote outposts of Cold War competition. What they find is architecture in the specific state of Antarctic decay. The insulation hanging from walls, the equipment frozen in positions it was in when the last person left, the records of 1,000 rocket launches buried under snow that has had 3 decades to accumulate undisturbed. The Cold War produced many things that outlasted the ideology that created them. Molodezhnaya is one of the stranger ones, a rocket test base on a continent with no indigenous population, abandoned when the government that built it ceased to exist, slowly being absorbed into the ice it was built on top of. The 7th and last place on this list is in Pennsylvania, in the middle of a country that prides itself on the kind of practical problem solving that should, in principle, be able to address a burning underground coal mine. Centralia has been on fire since 1962, and it is not out yet. The fire started in an old strip mine pit that the Centralia Borough Council was using as a dump during an attempt to clean up the site before a Memorial Day celebration. Whether it was an intentional burning of the accumulated garbage or an ember that found its way into the exposed coal seam through a gap in the mining pit's walls depends on which account you read, but the outcome is the same. The coal seam beneath Centralia caught fire. As long as burning coal is exposed to oxygen, it can continue to blaze for hundreds of years. The underground seam in Centralia is extensive enough that early estimates suggested the fire could continue burning for the next 250 years. For the first decade or so, the fire was a local problem that seemed, to various authorities who attempted to address it, manageable with one more intervention. Trenches were dug to isolate the burning section. The fire went around them. Carbon dioxide was injected into the mine. The fire continued. At some point in the 1970s, the fire crossed from the section where it had started into a larger, more extensively connected section of the coal seam, and at that point the question changed from how to stop it to what to do about a town built above a burning mine. Due to the sulfur and carbon monoxide seeping out of the mine, the town of 1,000 residents was evacuated in 1992, with only around a dozen people opting to stay in their homes. Those residents, elderly people who had lived in Centralia their entire lives and refused to leave on the grounds that they intended to die there, regardless of what the carbon monoxide in the soil was doing, were eventually granted the right to remain for the rest of their natural lives under a compromise reached with the Pennsylvania government. The last of them are still there, or recently were, living in a town where the street addresses have been officially deleted, the zip code discontinued, and the incorporation formally revoked by the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in 2002. What Centralia looks like today is less a ghost town in the conventional sense and more a ghost neighborhood, the streets still laid out in their original grid, the sidewalks still present, the trees growing in the places where front gardens used to be. But the houses are gone, demolished after the evacuation, their foundations covered by grass and weeds. In winter, steam rises from cracks in the roads and the earth, the thermal output of a coal seam that has been burning continuously for more than 60 years without human intervention and shows no sign of stopping. The hillside above the old mining area still smokes visibly in cold weather. Route 61, the main highway that once ran through the town, is permanently closed, its asphalt buckled and split by the ground movement above the fire. Fissures running across what used to be a 2-lane road in patterns that make it look like the earth itself got bored with being a road and decided to become something else instead. 7 places, on 6 continents, abandoned for 7 completely different reasons. A village whose tenants were evicted at 47 days' notice to make way for American soldiers and never allowed home. A diamond town where the diamonds ran out and the desert moved in. A fishing village whose harbor became too shallow for the boats that could make fishing worth doing. A medieval hilltop town that fell victim to the clay beneath 7 centuries of accumulated architecture. A French village where a wrong turn on an afternoon in June led to the deaths of 642 people, and the preservation of the scene of their deaths as a permanent monument to what was done to them. A Soviet rocket base on a continent without countries or citizens, left to the Antarctic winter when the country that built it stopped existing. And a Pennsylvania coal town sitting above a fire that has been burning since the year John Glenn orbited the Earth and shows no sign of stopping before the 22nd century. Each one of these places is a specific kind of evidence. Evidence of how quickly nature reclaims what humans abandon, whether with sand or vines or snow or simply weeds growing through cracked asphalt. Evidence of how the decisions made by governments and armies and mining companies produce consequences that outlast the people who made them, sometimes by decades, sometimes by centuries, sometimes apparently forever. And evidence of something harder to name, The specific quality of the human presence that these places retain long after the humans themselves are gone, the sense that the objects left behind, the cars still parked, the sewing machines still in position, the church still bearing the marks of what happened inside it, are not just artifacts, but arguments insisting on being witnessed by anyone willing to make the journey to stand among them and ask what happened here.